Major shifts in India's foreign policy from moral idealism to strategic pragmatism. Introduction. India's foreign policy since independence in 1947 represents one of the most complex transformations among post-colonial states. Emerging from nearly 2 centuries of colonial subordination, India inherited weak economic capacity, fragile institutional structures, unresolved territorial disputes, and limited military capability. Despite these structural constraints, India sought to construct an autonomous global identity rather than functioning as a subordinate client of any major power bloc. The evolution of Indian foreign policy therefore reflects the tension between normative ambition and material limitation. Over time, India transitioned from moral ideological posture grounded in anti-colonial solidarity towards a pragmatic strategic orientation driven by economic modernization, security concerns, and geopolitical competition. The major shift in India's foreign policy demonstrate a gradual but decisive movement from idealistic non-alignment towards flexible multi-alignment designed to maximize strategic autonomy and international influence. India's foreign policy cannot be understood as a static doctrine and must be analyzed by an adaptive system responding to changes in international structure, technological transformation, domestic political economy, and regional security threats should be taken under considerations. The Cold War bipolar system, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the emergence of globalization, as well as the rise of China and the diffusion of economic power across Asia, all compelled India to recalibrate its strategic behavior. Each stage of India's foreign policy evolution reveals adjustment in threat perception, alignment formation, economic priorities, and diplomatic instruments. Historical context of Indian foreign policy formation. The origins of Indian foreign policy lie in the intellectual and political legacy of the independence movement. Leaders such as Jawaharlal Nehru contextualized foreign policy as an extension of anti colonial resistance and civilizational identity. India sought to project itself as a moral force in global politics, emphasizing peaceful coexistence, sovereign equality, anti imperialism, and respect for territorial integrity. This orientation reflects both ideological conviction and material necessity. As a newly independent state facing developmental challenges, India lacked the economic and military resources required to participate in great power rivalry. Consequently, its diplomatic strategy emphasized norm entrepreneurship rather than coercive capacity. This immediate post independence movement represented multiple constraints. Partition created enduring hostility with Pakistan, while unresolved border disputes with China introduced long term strategic uncertainty. India's domestic priorities focused on nation building, industrialization, poverty reduction, and institutional consolidation. Foreign policy therefore functioned as a protective mechanism designed to prevent external entanglements that could divert resources away from domestic development. The defensive orientation shaped India's early economic posture, contributed to the emergence of non alignment as the guided principle of international engagement. The non-aligned movement and strategic autonomy. Non-alignment represented the first major doctrinal pillar of Indian foreign policy. In the bipolar structure of the Cold War, most states aligned either with the United States-led capitalist bloc or the Soviet Union-led socialist bloc. India rejected this binary choice and instead advocated an independent path designed to preserve decision-making sovereignty. The Non-Alignment Movement or NAM, co-founded by India alongside Egypt, Yugoslavia, Indonesia and institutionalized this strategic posture. NAM functioned not merely as diplomatic coalition but as a normative project aimed at reshaping international relations through principles of mutual respect, non-aggression and peaceful coexistence. The Panchsheel Agreement between India and China in 1954 embodied these principles. Panchsheel articulated 5 norms of interstate conduct, including respect for territorial integrity, non-interference in internal affairs, and equality among nations. Indian leadership believed that adherence to these norms could mitigate security dilemmas and reduce incentives for military confrontation. However, the limitations of normative diplomacy became evident during the 1962 Sino-Indian War. China's military offensive exposed vulnerabilities in Indian defense preparedness and demonstrated that moral legitimacy alone could not guarantee territorial security. The failure of idealistic assumption forced Indian policymakers to reconsider the relationship between ethics and power in international politics. While India didn't formally abandon non-alignment, its interpretation became an increasingly flexible. Strategic autonomy remained the objective, but the means of achieving autonomy expanded to include selective cooperation with major powers, security pressures, and the Soviet partnership. The period between 1960s and 80s marked a gradual shift from normative non-alignment towards security-oriented alignment behavior. India faced persistent conflict with Pakistan, particularly over the disputed territory of Kashmir. The wars of 1965 and 1971 reinforced the perception that regional stability could be sustained solely through diplomatic dialogue. The 1971 Indo-Pakistan War, which resulted in the creation of Bangladesh, demonstrated India's willingness to intervene militarily in regional affairs when strategic interests were threatened. During this period, India developed a closer relationship with the Soviet Union. The Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation, signed in 1971 by late Prime Minister Sri Indira Gandhi, provided India with diplomatic support and military assistance. Although India continued to claim adherence to non-alignment, its growing dependence on Soviet defense technology and political backing indicated a pragmatic adaptation to structural constraints. The Soviet partnership enhanced India's deterrence capability and allowed it to balance pressure from China and Pakistan. This phase illustrates the gradual erosion of rigid ideological positioning in favor of strategic flexibility. India didn't formally join the Soviet bloc, but it accepted asymmetrical cooperation when national security required external support. The transformation highlights the emergence of realism as an implicit guiding logic in Indian foreign policy. Economic crisis and liberalization in the post-Cold War era. The collapse of the Soviet Union fundamentally altered the international system and forced India to undertake a comprehensive assessment of its external strategy. The loss of a key strategic partner coincided with a severe balance of payment crisis which threatened economic stability. In 1991, India initiated sweeping economic reforms aimed at liberalizing trade, deregulating industry, and attracting foreign investments. Economic liberalization not only transformed domestic economic policy but also shaped foreign policy priorities. Integration into the global economy required improved relations with Western states, particularly the United States. India's diplomatic posture shifted from ideological distance to pragmatic engagement. Trade liberalization increased India's exposure to international markets and enhanced incentives for cooperation with technologically advanced economies. Economic diplomacy emerged as a central instrument of foreign policy, linking domestic growth objectives with external partnerships. The nuclear tests conducted in 1998 further signaled India's intention to assert strategic autonomy within a multipolar international system. By demonstrating nuclear capability, India sought to establish credible deterrence against potential adversaries and enhancing its bargaining positions in global negotiations. Although the tests generated international criticism, they ultimately reinforced India's image as an emerging power unwilling to subordinate its security interests to external pressure. Strategic partnerships and the rise of the Indo-Pacific framework. The early 21st century witnessed an acceleration of India's engagement with global powers. Strategic partnerships with United States, Japan, Australia expanded cooperation in such areas such as defense technology, maritime security, and infrastructure development. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad, emerged as an important platform for coordinating policy responses to regional challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. The Indo-Pacific concept reflects the growing significance of maritime trading routes, technological supply chains, and geopolitical competition in Asia. China's rapid economic growth and modern militarization introduced new strategic uncertainties, particularly in relation to territorial disputes and regional influences. India responded by strengthening alliances that could provide balancing capacity without undermining strategic independence. The the Act East policy, illustrates India's intention to deepen engagement with Southeast Asian states by expanding economic ties, participating in regional institutions. India seeks to position itself as an integral component of Asian geopolitical architecture. This policy reflects recognition that future global economic growth will be concentrated in Asia, making regional integration essential for national development. Foreign policy transformation under Narendra Damodar Das Modi. Since 2014, India's foreign policy has displayed increased activism and diplomatic visibility. High-level engagement with major powers, including the United States, Japan, and Australia, have expanded cooperation in defense, trade, and technology sectors. Agreements such as COMCASA and BECA have enhanced interoperability between India and American military systems, improvising intelligence sharing, and operational coordination. India's engagement with multilateral institutions have also intensified. Participation in the G20 and advocacy for reform of the United Nations Security Council demonstrates India's aspirations to shape global governance structures. Climate diplomacy has emerged as another significant domain of engagement. Initiatives such as the International Solar Alliance reflects India's attempt to position itself as a leader in sustainable development while simultaneously addressing domestic energy requirements. Relations with China continue to represent one of the most complex dimensions of Indian foreign policy. Border tensions and strategic rivalry require continuous balancing between cooperation and competition. India seeks to avoid direct confrontation while simultaneously strengthening deterrence capacity through partnerships and military modernization. Economic diplomacy and the shift of expansion of soft power. Economic diplomacy has become increasingly central to India's international strategy. Initiatives such as Make in India aim to attract foreign investments and integrate India into global manufacturing networks. Trade agreements, infrastructure cooperation, and technological collaboration serve as instruments for enhancing economic competitiveness. India has also invested in soft power resources to enhance its global influence. Cultural diplomacy initiatives, including the promotion of yoga and the traditional knowledge systems, contribute to the construction of a favorable international image. Diaspora networks further extend India's influence by facilitating economic exchange, technology transfer, and political engagement across multiple regions. Soft power complements traditional diplomacy by reducing resistance to cooperation and increasing the attractiveness of partnership with India. The combination of economic engagement and cultural influence strengthens India's capacity to operate with diverse geopolitical environments. Structural drivers of policy transformation. The evolution of Indian foreign policy reflects broader structural changes in the international system. The transition from bipolarity to multipolarity increased the number of potential partners and reduced the constraints imposed by superpower rivalry. Globalization intensified economic interdependence, making isolation economically costly. Technological change increased the importance of innovation, knowledge exchange, and digital infrastructure, encouraging cooperation with technologically advanced states. Domestic political transformation also influenced foreign policy priorities. Economic liberalization generated new interest groups favoring global integration. The expansion of middle class consumption increased demand for stable international trade relationships. The strategic communities with India increasingly recognize the necessity of balancing economic growth with national security concerns. The rise of China as a global power constitutes one of the most significant drivers of India's contemporary foreign policy orientation. China's economic expansion, infrastructure diplomacy, and military modernization introduce strategic challenges that require coordinated responses. India's engagement with the Quad and Indo-Pacific framework reflects the efforts to maintain regional balance without provoking direct confrontation. Continuity and change in strategic doctrine. Despite substantial changes, certain principles remain consistent across different phases of Indian foreign policy. The strategic autonomy continues to function as a central objective, guiding diplomatic tension. India seeks partnerships that enhance national capacity without creating dependency. This approach allows flexibility in responding to changes and ever changing geopolitical circumstances. Indian foreign policy demonstrates a synthesis of realism and idealism. Normative comments to sovereignty and peaceful coexistence coexist with pragmatic recognition of power politics. This hybrid orientation allows India to engage with diverse partners while preserving decision making independence. The persistence of strategic autonomy illustrates the long term continuity underlying apparent policy shifts. Rather than abandoning early principles, India has adapted them to new conditions. Non alignment has evolved into multi alignment, reflecting a transition from passive neutrality to active balancing. Conclusion. The major shift in India's foreign policy illustrates a gradual transformation from post colonial vulnerability to emerging power status. Each phase of policy evolution reflects adaptation to structural constraints, domestic priorities, and geopolitical opportunities. From the moral idealism of non alignment to the strategic pragmatism of multi alignment, India has sought to preserve autonomy while expanding influence. Economic liberalization, nuclear capability, regional partnerships, and global engagement has collectively enhanced India's position with the international system. Contemporary foreign policy combines economic diplomacy, security cooperation, and technological partnership, as well as cultural influence to maximize strategy flexibility. India's ability to operate simultaneously within multiple geopolitical frameworks allows it to pursue national interests without rigid alignment commitments. As global power distribution continues to evolve, Indian foreign policy is likely to remain adaptive and multidimensional. The interplay between continuity and change will continue to shape Indian international behavior, reflecting the ongoing pursuit of strategic autonomy in an increasingly complex global environment.